In game 14 of 1951 World Championship match, the challenger David Bronstein got a better position after the opening, as he had space advantage and prospects of attack on kingside. However, after his inaccuracies, the world champion Mikhail Botvinnik seized the initiative by activating his queen and rook, after which his seemingly passive knight started a sudden counterattack, making a phenomenal raid into enemy territory and demolishing Bronstein's kingside, after which the challenger's position became critical. Bronstein started with knight f3, Botvinnik played e6, g3, d5, bishop g2, c5, castle kingside, knight c6, d3, g6, e4. So Bronstein is playing King's Indian attack. Bishop g7, queen e2, knight e7. This is Botvinnik's favorite formation, fianchetto of dark squared bishop and development of the knight on e7. However, against King's Indian attack, this formation proves to be not so effective, as this game will show. And Bronstein plays e5. This is a typical move in King's Indian attack. The pawn is crossing the center, grabs space, and white is going to play on the king side against the weakened dark squares. So white's typical plan is to start the attack on the king side by playing h4, bishop f4, defending the pawn on e5, and also preparing after rook e1, knight d2, knight f1, queen d2, queen stands on the same diagonal with the bishop exerting pressure on this diagonal, and the knight from f1 is moving to h2 and then g4, and white pieces exert very strong pressure on the king side and on the weakened squares, while black is playing on the queen side by playing b5, bishop a6, rook c8, and later b4 or c4 or d4, so black would have a counterplay on the queen side. These are the typical plans of the sides in King's Indian attack. Queen c7, attacking e5 third time, that's why rook e1 defending it, and Botvinnik played h6. So he delays the castle, because on the king side the king would undergo very unpleasant attack. So he wants to keep his chances of castling queenside alive and doesn't want to commit. c3. This is also a typical move, taking under control very important central square, and also preparing d4 when the appropriate time comes, reinforcing the center and defending the pawn on e5 with a pawn. Bishop d7, so black can also castle queenside. Knight a3, the knight is rerouted from c2 to e3, and of course after bishop f4, first defending the pawn, to g4, and on g4 it would attack all weaknesses of black. And also, by the way, by playing knight a3, the knight is threatening to jump to b5 with tempo and then penetrate on d6. That's why Botvinnik prevents it by playing a6 and rook b1, in order to start immediate pawn storm on the queen side in case black castles queenside. So now castling queenside is also dangerous. Botvinnik plays knight f5, knight c2, and rook c8. So now the only side black can castle is the king side. And Bronstein plays h4. So this is a typical move. After black castles, the pawn can move further when the right time comes, weakening the king side. And also on h4, it controls g5 square, so that after white plays bishop f4, black cannot harass the bishop by playing g5, as g5 is now under white pawn's control. So here it would have been better probably for black to castle immediately without losing tempi, because black will have to castle sooner or later. Instead of this, Botvinnik continues to delay and played queen a5. This move, however, has its point. It attacks the pawn on a2 and provokes the weakening of the queen side, a3. However, still it was better to castle. And now that the queen finished reached its aim, which was the weakening of the queen side, it returns to d8. So black just spent 2 tempi, and this proves to be not so effective. Bishop f4. Bronstein just continues making the typical moves in King's Indian attack and preparing his pieces for the attack. And finally, Botvinnik castles kingside. And here Bronstein made an inaccurate move. He played knight e3, and this move leads to the exchange of pieces. And when you have the space advantage, this is a general rule of chess, you should avoid the exchange of pieces, because when your opponent has little space and a lot of pieces, the pieces would be cramped and the opponent will have difficulties in maneuvering the pieces, because there would be little space and a lot of pieces, and these pieces would prevent each other from moving effectively. But when the pieces are exchanged, then the lack of space isn't so dangerous anymore. And the fewer pieces one has with little space, the easier maneuvering of these pieces becomes. So the exchange of pieces is definitely in black's favor in this position. That's why instead of knight e3, Bronstein suggests in his annotations queen d2, just exerting more pressure on h6, and after king h7, knight h2. The knight is rerouted to g4, from which it would attack black's main weaknesses. And after b5, knight g4, white would be better. Or instead of this, Grandmaster Sveshnikov, who also annotated this game, suggests bishop h3. The bishop on g2 isn't doing anything, as it's limited by the pawn on d5. So black's most active piece is the knight on f5, so the bishop would be exchanged on f5. For example, after b5, bishop takes f5, g takes f, black's pawn structure is damaged, kingside is weakened, and after d4, white would reinforce the center and just continue the attack on the king side, and white would be better. So in both of these variations, instead of knight e3, white would be better. But Bronstein played knight e3, and this leads to the exchange of a pair of knights, after which the black's defense becomes easier. So currently h6 is under attack, that's why king h7, knight h2. Knight is rerouted to g4. So white is still better. White still has active play on the king side. And as knight g4 would attack h6 third time, Botvinnik plays knight e7, and after knight g4, knight g8. So from g8, knight defends h6. For the same purpose, instead of knight g8, it would have been possible more active knight f5. From f5, the knight also is defending h6 and also with tempo. However, Botvinnik played less active defensive move, knight g8. So the knight has purely defensive functions now. But later in the game, this knight will play the main role in black's counterattack. So queen d2, bishop c6, d4, c takes d, and here Bronstein, instead of natural solid c takes d with further occupation of the c file with rooks, he captured with queen. However, he had his point. By capturing with a queen, he keeps d4 square vacated. Now there is no pawn on d4. And this square can be later occupied by one of white pieces, and the piece on d4 would stand very good on a blockading square. However, still c takes d would have been more natural. So the bishop isn't doing anything on c6, as it's a bad bishop, limited by its own pawn. So Botvinnik moves it to another diagonal, bishop b5, and creating threat. Rook c4 would be unpleasant. That's why b3, taking under control c4 square, and white is threatening to play a4, pushing away the bishop from the active diagonal. That's why a5, vacating a6 square for the bishop, and after a4, bishop a6 followed. Now Bronstein played queen d2. Instead, it would have been better to play b4 immediately. He would play it next move, but immediately it would have been more active. He writes in his annotations that he wanted to move away his queen in advance, because after a takes b, c takes b, rook c4, attacking the queen would follow. However, queen d2 would have been possible, and white has slight advantage. But he moved his queen beforehand, queen d2, but this is less active. Queen e7, and now b4. But now bishop c4 followed. And here Botvinnik, Bronstein makes his final mistake, after which he loses all of his remaining parts of his advantage, and Botvinnik seizes the initiative. He captures on a5. Instead of it would have been much better to play b5, keeping the position closed on the queen side and in the center, and making this bishop very bad, because it would be limited by its own pawn, by white's pawn from all sides. So this bishop isn't doing anything. Black doesn't have any counterplay on the queen side, because the queen side is locked. The only weakness of white is the pawn on c3. However, Grandmaster Sveshnikov suggests the following plan. Reroute the bishop on f4 to d4, and on d4 the bishop would defend all weaknesses. The knight on e3, the bishop, which isn't doing anything, on g2 to h3, and then start the pawn storm on the king side, while black wouldn't have any counterplay in the center or on the queen side. But instead of this, Bronstein captured on a5. He had his point. His point was to open the rook's file, attack the weakness, and after this pawn disappears, a pawns would turn into passed pawns. However, it's not that simple. As there are two pawns, the support of the passed pawn from the rear by a rook would be problematic, because rook a1 wouldn't support the passed pawn, because the passed pawn is a5, but between the rook and a5 pawn there is another pawn on a4, and that means the rook on a1 wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't support the pawn at all, and that means that these pawns wouldn't be dangerous at all, and black would easily stop them, while the files on the queen side are open, and now black has very good chances to start a counterattack and to seize the initiative, which Botvinnik did immediately. So bishop a6, defending the weakness and opening the rook's file, and attacking the main weakness on c3. Bronstein played bishop f1, as the bishop wasn't doing anything on g2. Now he wants to exchange the bishops, after which b7 would be vulnerable, because the main defender of b7, the bishop on a6, would be exchanged. However, queen c5. Now black seizes the initiative, and c3 is under attack, and it falls. Bishop b5, queen takes c3, queen takes c3, rook takes c3, bishop takes a6, b takes a. And Bronstein played bishop b6, attacking the pawn, and after capturing it, the pawns would turn into passed pawns. However, as I already said, and as Bronstein himself mentions in his annotations, these pawns wouldn't be dangerous at all, while black has serious initiative. Instead of rook b6, Sveshnikov suggests rook c1, neutralizing the active rook on c3. However, Bronstein played rook b6. And very strong move by Botvinnik. Rook c4, attacking the pawn, and also the knight. There is X-ray. Black is threatening to play g5, and it turns out that the bishop won't be able to move, because the knight would fall in this case. And that's exactly what Bronstein missed in his calculations. He was going to play rook a1 in order to defend the pawn. However, he missed g5. And after h takes g, it turns out that the bishop cannot move as the knight falls. And that's why Bronstein played knight h2 in order to move the knight from g4, so that g5 doesn't win a piece. However, on h2, the knight is placed very passively, and black starts after this immediate counterattack. Instead of knight h2, Sveshnikov recommends, although black is threatening to play g5, which at first sight is deadly, winning a piece, still he suggests to capture on a6, and it turns out that after g5 Knight e3 is possible, leaving the bishop under attack, but in his turn attacking the rook, and after g takes f, knight takes c4, d takes c, g takes f, it turns out that the position would be more or less equal. But after knight h2, what Bronstein played, black starts the counterattack and gets a better position, very active position. And who starts the counterattack? The piece which is the less active piece at the moment. But now, with his next 5 moves, Botvinnik makes 5 moves in a row with this knight, and the knight starts its brilliant raid into the enemy territory, demolishing the king side. You can stop the video and try to find this brilliant march of the knight. So, knight e7, rook takes a6, knight c6, knight f3 activating the knight, knight b4 with tempo attacking the rook, rook b6, knight d3 again with tempo attacking the rook and the bishop, rook a1, and the 5th move, the knight sacrifices itself, exchanges itself for the bishop, but demolishes the king side. Knight takes f4, g takes f, rook takes f4. And now black pieces are very active. The pawn on e5 is weak, the knight is under attack, and after the f file opens, if it opens, both rooks are already placed on the f file, and the rooks would exert very strong pressure on f file, attacking both the knight and the weak pawn on f2. So black completely seized the initiative and has a better, much better position. So the knight on f3 is under attack, so king g2 defending it. And here, as was the case in most of the previous games, Botvinnik, in a better position with initiative, misses the best move, as he avoids the tactical battle, the sharpening, and he always plays positional solid chess against such a experienced, dangerous tactician as Bronstein. He didn't want to risk, and he always avoided tactical scrambles. That's why he played g5. However, it would have been stronger, instead of g5, to play f6. This move is suggested by both Bronstein and Sveshnikov. Bronstein, in his annotations, writes that there was even no need to calculate the variations. f6, it's obvious that f6 is a good move because it leads to the opening of f-file, and both rooks are placed on f-file, and also opening the diagonal of dark-squared bishop. And it would come even with greater effect, as the rook on a1 would be attacked by this bishop. So all black pieces would suddenly get very active after f6. Sveshnikov gives the variation. E takes f, rook takes f6, rook a3, defending the knight as it was already under attack of both rooks, e5. Both pawns now become mobile and they advance. So the central pawns are very dangerous now. Rook takes f6, bishop takes f6, rook b3, e4 attacking the knight, rook b7 check, king g8, knight h2, knight is threatening to jump to g4, but h5, a6, bishop takes h4, a7, bishop takes f2, promotion to queen, rook takes a8, king takes f2, rook takes a4. And black has 4 pawns for a piece, and only black has chances to win in this position. So that would be much better than g5, what Botvinnik played. However, after g5, he still has the advantage. Black is still better. And white's defense isn't so simple. H takes g, knight takes g5 check, king g6 attacking the knight, knight f3, and another strong move by Botvinnik, rook g8, placing the rook on the open file and creating very unpleasant x-ray. Now black is threatening to move the king, and after this threaten deadly bishop takes e5 check, and winning the rook also. So this move is very unpleasant. For example, if Bronstein played rook b7, he gives the following variation. Then the devilish king h7 would follow. opening the file and threatening the discovered check. And if knight g5 check, it doesn't help. King h6, knight takes f7 check, but black just sacrifices the exchange, and then deadly discovered check would follow, and white is losing the rook and black is winning in this position. That's why after rook g8, as the knight is under attack, the king must defend the knight, but the king himself is in danger because black has threats on the g file and the king can move, will be forced to move, and the knight would be unprotected. White played rook a3 in order to defend the knight and move away the rook from this unpleasant x-ray. Bishop f8 attacking the rook, rook d3, rook takes a4, king f1, rook a1 check, king e2, rook a2 check, rook d2, rook takes a5. So now black is a pawn up. Rook b8, however. But Bronstein found this move, and this is the only move he writes in his annotations, because it leads to the exchange of a pair of rooks. Because if the rooks weren't exchanged, black rooks together with a bishop would start a very strong attack on white king. That would be very dangerous. But now the pair of rooks is exchanged and the pressure is eased. Rook h8, knight d4, so Bronstein finally placed his piece, his knight, on blockading square. However, of course, he wished it to be in an absolutely different way, in the middle game with activity, but now, of course, it's only the defensive move, so he hopes to draw this game. Bishop g7, the rooks are exchanged. f4, rook a6, rook d1, rook a2 check, king f3, rook a3 check, king g4, bishop g7, king h4, bishop f8, and a strong move, f5 check. And after e takes f, it turns out that the pawns are extremely weak. All of them are isolated, they are doubled and weak, and they fall. Rook g1 check, king h7, knight takes f5, rook a6, rook g5. So this position is already drawn. Rook g3, rook e6 attacking the pawn, but rook f3, rook takes e5, the pieces are exchanged, and rook takes f7. And after king g6, rook f5, king g4, they agreed to a draw. Hit the like button, as it's really helpful for the channel growth, and see you in the analysis of game 15.